I'm Dana Perino, and this is Perino on Politics. "2024 was a year of political realignment that helped President-elect Trump reclaim the White House, and now we have a question. Will that last as a trend? Joining me this week is a founding partner at Echelon Insights and author of the very popular Substack, The Intersection. It is Patrick Ruffini. Many of you follow him. If you don't, you should. He has brilliant insights. And this is the politics podcast where I call up my smart friends and say, what do you think is going on? And I've been saving this up for the end of the year, Patrick, because every time you posted something or wrote your Substack, I'm also on your email list. I was like, wow, okay, that's a unique take. It's not a talking point. It's very thoughtful. We've talked a lot about the political realignment that we are living through, and it's a fascinating time to be a part of it. Now that the election is a few weeks behind us, is there anything that has come to mind that you think we should all think about or know as we go into the new year?
Yeah, I mean, I hope we don't lose sight of why President Trump was reelected, which is that, he did get unprecedented support from working class Americans across the racial divide and across the age divide. Let's not forget that. This was the narrowest gap between younger voters and older voters than we have seen since at least the year 2000. You had young people surging towards Trump. You had black men surging towards Trump. You had Hispanic men, but also, he made above average gains among younger women too, which certainly would come to the surprise of the Harris campaign and was certainly something that I don't think, really people were expecting, to see that in the exit polls. And I think this is a natural progression, right? I mean, we saw in 2016 how Trump made these breakthrough gains, particularly in the upper Midwest. And then you saw some, murmurs in 2020 along the border in Miami with Hispanics and different immigrant communities that just really blew open in 2020, where like anywhere you look on the map, you see these gains. You see them in places like New York City. You see them in LA. You see them in swing states too, but really it's the big cities that swung pretty decisively his way. So I hope we don't lose sight as we, create, put together the cabinet, which is well on its way, and craft the policies of this administration, that we don't forget and lose sight of who put him there.
On the working class voters and breaking through the racial categories, was it about the economy, or was culture also a part of it?
I think it was both. The economy created an opportunity this year for something that was probably going to happen anyway to happen sooner, when you have younger people in particular who tend to be more diverse, when you have an economy that hits them the hardest, right, with inflation, people with few savings, people with fewer job prospects, particularly in the post-COVID environment, where just things kind of got turned upside down. And it's the people with less of a track record in the workplace that felt the most insecure over the last 4 years. And so I think we saw a shift related to the economy among young people and diverse audiences towards President Trump. But I think they're fundamentally the reason why I think they could feel comfortable making that choice is that they were not aligned with Kamala Harris and the Democrats on the cultural issues either. Right. I mean, this was something where, for a long time, it was the Democrats, who were sort of like the default party if you're economically struggling, if you're somebody who, needs extra help, or if you're somebody who is working class, you voted Democratic as an article of faith. And that has just completely broken down. I don't think anybody recognizes that anymore as what the Democratic Party of today stands for. Mm-hmm.
I've said on the 5 that I felt the Democrats are in this endless game of bumper cars since the election. Like when when you get stuck in bumper cars and you can't get out and you can't go forward, you can't go sideways, you can't go backwards, and you try, and then you just keep running into each other, and there's a lot of frustration. I know at some point they're going to find their footing and there will be a leader that emerges and all of these things cycle through. But right now it is pretty remarkable how the Democrats cannot settle down after the election.
Yeah, and I think the story that they're telling themselves is going to make it less likely for them to find that anytime soon. If they're telling a story, well, it was just the economy. Well, Joe Biden got out of the race late. Well, it was just unwinnable, right? And it didn't have anything to do with how we're perceived with working class voters. They didn't have anything to do with our specific policies, particularly on these cultural issues. And I think they're eager to try and not learn those lessons at the moment. We did some polling ourselves of, asking Democrats why they thought they lost. And this is rank and file Democrats. But I think it was struck to the extent to which that the rank and file Democrats really were parroting a lot of the talking points coming from above, saying, okay, well, maybe Kamala Harris couldn't have done anything to win the election. Obviously, it was a bad year for Democrats. All of that's true in a sense, but it ignores kind of the deeper structural problems with the Democratic Party. It ignores her flaws as a candidate, and it ignores, I think the fact that this has been going on for quite some time over the last few election cycles, at least.
I have a colleague on the 5 called Jessica Tarloff. She's a Democrat, and I say this in good fun because I also say this in front of her. She was very focused on talking about metrics of the Harris campaign. And, for example, they would say, but they knocked on 2,000 doors yesterday, and they did this number of things, and it was all these metrics of things. And I said, yeah, but that's like when Waze tells you you're supposed to go this way, but in your gut that the safe way is around the corner to the left. And why does Waze want to take you all the way around here? But you decide to put all of your trust in this data that the computer is telling you to go this way. So you went right when you should have gone left. And I felt the same about even the Hillary Clinton campaign of 2016, when she had staff members saying, we're in Michigan and we could really use some help here. We cannot figure out why we can't get a foothold. We need a visit from her. And the campaign headquarters in Brooklyn said, nope, our numbers say that you're exactly fine. Is there something that is fundamentally missing in terms of a gut instinct when it comes to how they're evaluating?
Yeah, I can't make it out. Maybe they themselves felt like it was hopeless, right? I mean, that's the only conclusion I could come to, because you really saw very early on after they did the candidate switch, and Harris was pulling pretty well. Actually, some of her messaging was actually what I would have done in their shoes, right? It was talking about inflation. It was talking about, it was really kind of going after the corporate price gouging, right? I mean, whether that's accurate or not, I mean, the polls show that that's probably their best message, right? Sometime around October 1st, she starts talking about, well, Trump is a Nazi, right? I mean, she starts talking about these issues that were very similar to the way that Hillary would talk about Trump, or very similar to the way Joe Biden wanted to campaign against Trump, was this threat to democracy. And then she ends it on, a week before the election. She ends with a speech on the Ellipse in Washington, D.C., closing her campaign in the center of the swamp, which I think most people, you don't necessarily have to buy that terminology for Washington, D.C. to know that voters don't like Washington, D.C. And yet that's the imagery, right, she associated herself with in the closing phase of the campaign. And so I think she had maybe a shot. She had maybe an outside shot with that message early on. And as they were seeing, again, there were metrics too pointing in another direction. There were the early voting metrics that were starting to come in right around early October that were really showing Republicans super energized in voting early in a way that they hadn't voted before. And that was exactly right. That exact same thing happened on election day. But I think they got spooked and said, well, we really need to mobilize our base, right? We're behind. Let's stop focusing on these independent swing voters, these working class voters, and let's just focus on getting all of our Democratic voters out.
And they also seem to think that there were so many more Never Trump Republicans out there to vote for her that I thought that was really weird. And I know some of those folks, but also wanted to ask you about this. For President Trump, I think it's a combination of everything, but if you had to put a weight on what thing mattered the most, Is it the policy proposals, the messaging about those policy proposals, the medium by which he tried to get that message out, or is it the messenger?
Look, it's always a combination. I think it's always I think it's the substance of what he stands for. And I do believe that, his supporters, I think, trust him implicitly to deliver on these issues and not just talk about these issues, but deliver on these issues. And people saw him delivering. I think the biggest factor, by far, was his performance in office in his first term, where people saw what the economy was doing. People saw the border was secure. People saw him actually performing. And you can't beat that in terms of having a side-by-side comparison to the current administration. So I think that was that was really the overriding factor in everything, that most people came to appreciate him more as a result of that record.
And it seems like that's continued and even grown since the election.
Yeah. That's right. He's over 50% approval. Some polls have him over positive on his favorability ratings. And I think it just goes to show you, right, because certainly, Democrats last time really threw everything in. The media threw everything at him, even after the election. And it seems that, that seems to have artificially kept his numbers down at that point. And then, you see what happens when, I think the media is trying to maybe play a different role this time. We will see. I'm sure they'll get going. They'll get going once again.
They really do not have their footing. And I think part of it is that being a journalist at the level with the White House, it's a muscle that you have to exercise all the time, or you kind of forget. And Joe Biden did such a little amount of press, and even the White House briefings pointless, that there's just no exercising of that muscle to ask questions that are really thoughtful, probing, or that aren't so obvious. Like when Donald Trump was asked yesterday at the press conference, we're recording this on Tuesday the 17th, at the press conference at Mar-a-Lago, he is asked, are you going to strike Iran? And he's like, come on, I'm obviously not going to answer that. And I said to my colleagues, there's a different way to ask that would maybe not get that kind of reaction, such as, do you believe that Israel has a right to defend itself from an enemy that might have a nuclear weapon? And would you like to see this problem solved before you take office? He still might not answer it, but at least you wouldn't be admonished in front of the world. I had one other question in this segment, and that is, how permanent do you think the realignment is? I know nothing's ever written in stone when it comes to politics, but this feels like a new coalition to me that has some running room for the foreseeable future, but wanted to get your take.
Sure. I think this has actually been going on for quite a long time, actually. Like, I think that 2016 was a breakthrough election. 2024 was in many ways a breakthrough election. But, as I talk about in my book, right, you can go back to the 19th. So it's a party of the people inside the multiracial populist coalition remaking the GOP. And the point I wanted to make, this wasn't a book about 2024 or what was going to happen in 2024, although it seems a lot of the things I talk about seems to have come true.
Right. It's
sooner.
Remarkable.
Yeah, right. But the point I wanted to make is, you could go back to the 1960s, early 1970s, and the anti-war protests. You saw the New Deal Democrats moving more and more into the Republican Party, first with Richard Nixon, then with Ronald Reagan. Then you saw in 2000, so many states flip, right? You saw West Virginia flip. You saw these states that were solid blue, working class states all flip. And
is that why when I worked for President Bush, we went to West Virginia every 6 weeks?
That's right. I remember that. I remember, every Sunday, right? Must be West Virginia. I think that was
every 4th of July, right? For sure.
Yeah. So very close. And it was something they intentionally focused. So that was really the precursor. So you've seen this realignment happen for a while, but I think people just hadn't caught up to it. Right. You still have people, I think even this year, as early as the primaries this year, saying, well, if you can just somehow manage to beat Trump in the primary, we can just kind of go back to the way things were. And I don't think things are ever going back to the way things were, in the same way that I don't think things are going back to the way things were before Ronald Reagan, when Ronald Reagan took over the party. I think there are some leaders who are just fundamentally transformational within the party. And I think Donald Trump has proven himself. We weren't sure of that after 2016. But after this remarkable comeback, I think we can be more sure of it. But I think this is not a commentary of, the Republican, they're going to have a majority for as far as the eye can see. This is not necessarily about that. It's about who is the Republican voter and who is the Democratic voter. Who are we as Republicans? I speak as a Republican pollsters. Who are we here to serve? And, what kinds of people are we here to serve? And that's just fundamentally a different answer to the question than it was when I first started working in politics. It is definitely a more working class, blue collar electorate, and is increasingly a diverse electorate. So that's the main message, right, I want to communicate, right? I don't think this is the end of politics. It's not the end of two-party politics, but the parties have changed a lot.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, and that's a great segue. We will take a quick break and be right back. And we're back with Perino on politics, and Patrick Ruffini is my guest. Can I ask you a little bit about polling and focus groups? I know that it's changed a lot since you got into the business and since I started following your work. And do you think that with new technologies and new approaches, the industry is figuring it out?
Well, certainly I think the industry came closer to figuring out this year, but for the third time in a row, it underestimated Donald Trump, right? It didn't underestimate it by as much. It kind of gave us an idea of where things were headed. Some of the polls were really quite good in terms of showing us the direction. And I think, if you only read the polls, I think you probably had a pretty good idea of how this was probably going to go, but it wasn't maybe quite as emphatic or certain, right, about that conclusion. I do think that pollsters have seen the mistakes of 2016, seen the mistakes of 2020. I think we got better polls this year as a result, but they still weren't perfect.
What do you think of President Trump saying he's going to sue the Des Moines Register for the last Ann Seltzer poll? He said it was biased. I don't know. I feel like it kind of undercuts his message on the other legitimate claims of bias from journalists that he's had. But what about you?
Well, look, I won't trash Ann Seltzer. I think she's a straight shooter. She is a legend in the community. She got it right for election after election after election. But the problem is you can't get it right forever. And I think that people imbued this particular poll because she got right, and maybe she was a little lucky too along the way. I think I won't. That's also a big factor in a lot of these things. That people imbued this particular survey with such a religious certainty, right? That they took on this quasi, this significance that was just far beyond any other poll. When any pollster would tell you, my poll is not the be all end all. My poll should just, probably as far as the horse race numbers go, just toss it in with the others in the average, right? I mean, that's what you should be doing. And yet, I think the left ran with this narrative, right? And tried to spin up this false narrative heading into election day that wasn't really borne out anywhere else in the data.
And I don't see how that is the polls' fault. I mean, unless they purposely didn't include Trump voters, I mean, that doesn't make that much sense to me. But regardless, we don't have to talk about that too much. Do you have thoughts on gambling sites like Predict It?
Look, I think it's one of those things, they work until they don't. And, for now, just like Ann Seltzer all those years, I think they've had a good track record in terms of, let's say, the term I would use is, they accurately priced Trump. It's not like any of these sites are going to tell you with 100% certainty who's going to win. But they said, yeah, he probably has a better chance than the polls say that he does. But at the end of the day, and that turned out to be a right assumption. I don't know that that's going to be a right assumption under a future Republican, right? I mean, you're going to have a different candidate next time. And potentially you just might have a different dynamic, whether or not people then will also be kind of making that same assumption. So that was the reason, right, that enabled those sites to be right. But heck, I think it's really interesting, right? Because when you had on debate nights in particular, it's not like you're getting polling during debate nights. You're really relying on people's guts, people's perceptions across millions of people, thousands of people trading, whatever the number is. And so I was watching on those debate nights to see, who's up, who's down, right? Minute by minute, how things were changing. And particularly that first debate against Biden, all right? I mean, that was just a wild ride on the prediction markets.
Yeah, that is the day that my assistant, Kate DiPietro, her first day of training to be my new assistant was the night of the debate on June 27th. And it's been a wild ride ever since. On more of a policy topic or a movement topic, for so long, a lot of people describe themselves, and I would put myself in this category, even though I'm probably more socially conservative than I used to say or think, partly because it was acceptable. But a majority of people are not what I used to say, which is fiscally conservative and socially liberal. But they are actually socially conservative and fiscally liberal. And our government budget and deficit and our debt prove that out. I thought it was the opposite for so long, but I guess I was just in my bubble. And it was your colleague, Kristen Silverberg, who set me straight a few years ago. And I've been watching this trend ever since. This is pretty big to me. How do you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a populist center of gravity in American politics, and that how I describe populism is people who, are not certainly not far left on economic issues, but maybe they lean a little bit towards the idea that, hey, it's okay if government gets involved in certain things in the economy, right? We aren't for these huge tax cuts for wealthy people. And those sorts of ideas. And they are also at the same time more socially conservative on a lot of issues than they are economically conservative. So when I say that's populism, right? I mean, that definition is one that I don't know that Trump read this polling data and in 2016 aimed his rhetoric at those people exactly because of that polling data. But I think he had an intuition that this was just a much larger group of people. And so I think he came across, right, as somebody who was not, a free market fundamentalist or, an orthodox free trader, right? And he's very, very much the opposite of that, and taking positions that used to be associated with, frankly, the labor unions. And, in the 1990s, it was the labor unions that were both saying we can't have uncontrolled immigration because it takes away American jobs for our workers. And we can't have these free trade deals. And Trump has since come to embody that agenda. In fact, Democrats have completely forfeited, I think, any claim, right, to that. Whereas before, in the 1990s, under Bill Clinton, a voter like that could really feel at home in the Democratic Party because they weren't far left on these cultural issues, taken as a whole. They were pretty moderate on those issues, and, their economic ideas were more in line with theirs. And now Trump has really absolutely captured that center of the electorate.
He certainly has. It's been very interesting. My last question in this block is there anything that can be done about distrust in government and the media in this period where America is like, okay, well, we had a strong electoral college result. I know the country's still a little bit 50-50, but there's momentum and wind at the president's back. Can trust in media and government improve?
Well, it seems like it can't get any worse.
That's for
so
sure.
I think that would be the optimistic case for it. I don't see trust completely recovering to points where it was, maybe in the 20th century. But it seems like, and you see this in decisions like Jeff Bezos and not endorsing a candidate for president, Washington Post. You see that basically in the last administration, the media became openly and brazenly partisan actors, right? That we're really trying to back up the Democrats and do the Democrats' job for them, rather than an independent, neutral actor that was, really just called balls and strikes on both sides. I mean, that's what you should be in the media. And so I think that undermined trust to the extent where we're the only people, right? I mean, they've lost audiences, right? I mean, they've lost any semblance of having or wanting to reach a bipartisan audience. So in many ways, right, the incentive structures for these legacy media organizations are such that you really only, you really are only going after voters on one side who, think agree with you because you're putting up this faux partisan front, right? So I do think that like alternative media is growing, podcasts are growing, and you're seeing a much more diverse and flourishing media ecosystem as a result. It's
an interesting time to be in politics and media. We'll be right back with more Perino on Politics. And we're back with the last segment on Perino on Politics. And Patrick Ruffini, remind everybody about your book and where they can get it.
Sure. Again, it's Party of the People inside the multiracial populist coalition, remaking the GOP, and available on Amazon or anywhere fine books are sold.
And is there an audiobook as well?
There is an audiobook you can get on Audible and I'm sure other platforms too.
I think that it would be very interesting for college students, if they're taking Politics 101 or 220 or whatever it is, to read this book, because they are living in such an interesting time and are about to enter their adulthood in the middle of a political realignment that will affect their lives. So your book is perfect for all sorts of people, but in particular, young people, I think, would benefit from listening to it or reading it. They should definitely buy it, or the colleges should for sure. So this is the segment where I ask, is there anything that I'm missing? What are you paying attention to right now that might not be on my radar?
Well, we've covered a lot of it, but I want to drill down on that point you just made about young people, which is an undercovered narrative of this election, where you've seen since the election and you had during the election, Trump made these very big gains with younger voters. You see it even on college campuses and some of the precinct data that's come back. And since the election, you see majorities of younger voters saying they approve of the transition, saying they hold him, they are favorable towards him, which would have been absolutely, completely unthinkable. And so not only, right, I mean, I think we're seeing a racial realignment in some of the results, but I think you may be seeing a generational realignment, and you may be seeing, if, and obviously, like, this can go south, right? I mean, there's no, I think in particular, I mean, we saw this during the second George W. Bush years. I mean, we started out with a head, and I worked in the administration too. We started out in a head, with a head of steam right after that election, but quickly lost it because of events. So you can't always, obviously that can happen. But I think at the present moment, I think you're having voters who never would have voted for a Republican before. Who went over this time, and now it's the job of the president, this administration, to solidify to keep that support and potentially keep it on our side for a long time. It's been interesting to watch. It's cool to be a Republican. I mean, I've worked in Republican politics since 1995. It was never cool, but it's fun. It's fun to watch these young people explore and think about it, and hopefully all of these matters are not completely overtaken by events, but there are world currents that are swirling out there. And sometimes those problems just land on the Oval Office desk and the president of the United States has to deal with it. But he's got the wind at his back. And so do I, going into the new year, having had a chance to talk to you. Patrick Ruffini, thank you so much. Where can people find your Substack? I know it's on Substack. It's called The Intersection, but if you Google my name, or it's patrickruffini.com. It's really good stuff, and I commend it to everybody. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Merry Christmas to you, too. Take care. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.